We're going to talk about an important piece of legislation called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1854, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas had a vision of a transcontinental railroad going from Chicago westward. We already had rail lines from the East Coast to Chicago, and it was his vision and his goal to have a transcontinental railroad that would go from Chicago through the West. Okay? He thought that would be a benefit for the country, which definitely would be. Well, in order to achieve this goal, he had to send a bill through Congress that would allow the federal government to pay for such railroad. Okay? So in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois has a vision of a transcontinental railroad that would go westward from Chicago. In order to achieve that goal, he had to sponsor a bill through Congress that would allow the federal government to pay for the construction of the rail line. Now, because of the issue of slavery and what he knew would happen, his bill also called for two other things. Okay, so this bill not only calls for federal funding for this transcontinental railroad, but it also calls for these two things. Number one, a repeal of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. A repeal of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now let's stop there a minute and think. There's a difference between the Talmadge Amendment that had to do with slavery and the compromise that was brought up by the Senate. Do you remember? Do you remember what that compromise was that the Senate came up with that allowed the thing to pass?
36.
That's the key. Maine came in as a free state, Missouri came in as a slave state, but the key was all lands north of 3630 would be free and all lands south would be slave. Now if they repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that goes out the window, which is going to open up the issue of slavery again in the northern part, right? He did that purposely. The second part of his bill, and it'll make sense when I tell you that the first part will make sense when I tell you the second part, is there was this land west of the Mississippi in this area right here. And it was kind of just territorial land, and he petitioned to have this land separated into two territories. The Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory. That was the second part of the addition to his bill. So his bill was written to get the federal government to finance a rail line. But included in that bill was number one, the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, which would disallow the 3630 line. It obviously isn't going to disallow the states that already came in, right? Okay, and he also put in there that this mass territory west of the Mississippi that we know now as Nebraska and Kansas be organized into separate territories, Nebraska and Kansas. Okay? Now, Senator Douglas sent his bill to Congress. Both houses of Congress passed it. It became known in American history as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But that isn't the problem. We're going to get into the problem in a minute. Now, if all of a sudden I establish two new school stores in this building, and I told you kids that you could go to that school store and pick out the best candy that you wanted for free, what would happen when I said go? You guys would all run out of here and you'd go find the best candy in the store because it's going to be free, and it would be a first come, first served fiasco, right? Well, that's kind of what happened when they established these territories in Kansas and Nebraska. Both northerners and southerners sprinted to these areas because they wanted to get not the best candy, but the best land. Okay? Now, what type of people ran there? Settlers and maybe and now come on, I'm not comparing classes, but they can get this right away. Yes, yes, land speculators that we're going to go get some land and sell it at profit. So Farmers isn't exactly wrong, it's not great farming. Some can be at that point. But settlers went that way as fast as they could to get the best lands, and land speculators. They had a big race to the candy store. Okay? Now, let me ask you this question. When the Missouri Compromise was repealed, what is going to be the issue of slavery in these two new territories? What are they going to use? Popular sovereignty or territorial rights. The people that go in there are going to make the decision. Whoever populates. The problem was, especially in Kansas, people rushed into Kansas and some were Northerners and some were Southerners. Okay? Now, it got so bad that they actually ended up with two different territorial constitutions. It was absolutely in chaos because these people rushed into Kansas. They claimed this land. Some were Northerners, some were Southerners. They couldn't decide whether it was going to be a free territory or a slave territory. And that was pretty big because when they would petition to come in as a state, that's what they would be coming in as, right? And so by the end of 1855, the feelings were split so much between the people who settled the Kansas territory that they had governmental chaos. They had actually separated within the territory and had two different territorial constitutions. That is not going to work, right? What's that going to lead to? Well, it's going to lead to violence first, and we'll get into that. But you're going to have an anti-slavery constitution and a pro-slavery constitution in the same territory. Whose job is it going to be to fix this thing? Who has to fix this problem? The government or Congress. Well, that takes us to our next subtopic then, which is bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, which tells you what's going to happen in Kansas. Blood, fighting, violence, and blood. Now, while Congress is back in Washington, D.C. trying to solve this dilemma in the Kansas territory, and it is a dilemma, violence starts to break out in Kansas over land and slavery. Because both Northerners, as I mentioned, and Southerners rushed to that area to get the best thing, and it turned out tough. So as Jaden runs and Carla runs to the candy store, and Carla grabs the best thing in there, and Jaden thought he had it first, pretty soon we got a fight, okay? And it got ugly, okay? Matter of fact, they estimated that during this fighting over slavery and disputed land claims in Kansas, probably more than 200 men and women were killed over this deal. That's how bad it got. So bloodshed was rampant in Kansas over this issue. It got so bad, what did the federal government have to do? Send troops. They had to send military troops in to restore order. That's how crazy it got in Kansas. And that's how it got the nickname Bleeding Kansas. But it gets a little bit worse because I'm going to give you two specific examples of this violence that led to bloodshed. Okay? Then you're going to learn a lesson about 1974. Now here are the two specific examples of violence that occurred in the Kansas territory that people most remember. Number one, there was a town in Kansas called Lawrence. And in Lawrence, the biggest population, if not all of the population, were anti-slavery citizens. They were people that lived in Lawrence, Kansas that were against slavery. Well, what happened, our first example, is a pro-slavery group, those that were for slavery, armed themselves, went in and burnt Lawrence to the ground and hurt or killed some of these anti-slavery citizens that were living there. So there's your first example, is an armed pro-slavery group goes to the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which is at the time populated with most, if not all, anti-slavery people, set the town on fire, beat and killed people in the town. Well, what happens when something like that happens? Somebody always seeks revenge. So the second example is a fanatical white abolitionist. An abolitionist is someone that wants to abolish slavery, by the name of John Brown steps into the picture. So in revenge, a fanatical white abolitionist, that's someone that's abolishing slavery, by the name of John Brown, gathers up his own armed group, including his own sons, and he goes and kills, murders 5 unarmed pro-slavery citizens in revenge. Okay? So, in revenge for what the pro-slavery people did in Lawrence, Kansas against the anti-slavery citizens living there, a fanatical abolitionist, white abolitionist by the name of John Brown gathers up a group of people, including his own sons, and he runs around that area and murders basically 5 unarmed pro-slavery men. Now, here's your little bit of a lesson in 1974, and then we'll move on and come back. Has anybody heard this song? And my voice is a little off today, so it won't be as perfect as usual. Ever heard this song? Carry on, my wayward son. Who sings that? Kansas. Rock group Kansas, 1974. Here they are. This is an original 1974 Kansas album. And why in the world would I care about that? All the groups of these guys, and I'll give you a little secret, when we get done with the lecture, I'm going to get on YouTube and show you them live in concert in 1974. These guys were from high school in Kansas. This is their first album cover that made them famous. You want to guess who's on the cover? John Brown. John Brown. This is the white abolitionist John Brown, who led the Bleeding Kansas charge that the rock group chose to put on the cover of their album. That's pretty cool. Now, when we get through the lecture today, we'll stop a little early, and I've got YouTube videos to show you on 3 different songs that Kansas sang, and they're awesome. Brings back the memories, baby, because I used to have hair like that. But anyway, not like that. I'm going to show you 2 songs live in concert and 1 song live in concert. The first 2 will be in 1974. The last one will be in 2016. The old boys come back for a comeback. Kansas. You can see the difference in their appearance. Anyway, I always get excited about talk about Bleeding Kansas to show you the Kansas album, because that's what I grew up with. All right. Well, any questions on Bleeding Kansas? We got another conflict, right, that's going to take us into Civil War. Well, that'll take us to a political election, 1856. And the people in Wyoming, for the most part, and maybe most of you in this room will be excited about what happens in this election. Because we got 2 political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs kind of got it handed to them the last election because Winfield Scott didn't get her done. So the Whig party's kind of fading out. And a new political party's coming back on the scene. Anybody want to guess what the party's name is? What? Republicans. Yes, a group of Thomas Jefferson philosophical supporters bring back the old Republican Party. So in this particular election, you're going to have the Democrats versus the Republicans, and it stays pretty much from now until present that we have these 2 political parties as our main 2. So the Republicans make a huge comeback. The new party took its name from Thomas Jefferson's party. They were Jeffersonian democracy, and they reestablished themselves in American politics. But the Democratic Party, who holds the White House, nominate James Buchanan of Pennsylvania as their candidate. So James Buchanan of Pennsylvania will be the Democratic candidate in this particular election. Now, if anyone can guess who the Republican candidate was, on people we've talked about in the past, I don't know how much conversation you have between classes, I'll give you 5 points extra credit. 10, 9, nope, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. John C. Fremont.
You were so close.
John C. Fremont. Now, I want to go back and tell you how this is an example how people copycat. In the election of 1848, the Free Soil Party came into the being, right? And their slogan was free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Well, I'll be darned if the Republicans' slogan in 1856 was free soil, free speech, free men, and... Really?
Free food.
Fremont.
Fremont. Fremont. Free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont. Now, this election was actually closer than people thought. However, James Buchanan wins the election. James Buchanan, the Democrat, wins 174 electoral votes to 114 for Fremont. So James Buchanan becomes the 15th President of the United States, mostly remembered for being the guy that was president before Abraham Lincoln. So he's the 15th President, James Buchanan, as a result of the election of
How many
1856.
did he win with again?
174 to 114. Now, we've got a thinker here. Because we're going to go on to the next subtopic, and you're actually going to have a writing assignment due tomorrow at the start of the period based on this subtopic. And we're going to do part of it today before we end up, and then you're going to finish it tomorrow. And that's the Dred-Scott decision. This is a really important Supreme Court decision. What's the last Supreme Court decision we really emphasized to you? Anybody remember the two M's? Madison versus Marbury. Okay? This one will be the Dred-Scott decision. This is an incredibly interesting decision. And who does it involve? It involves a fellow by the name of Dred Scott. And I'll tell you what happened. On March 6th of 1857, on March 6th of 1857, the Supreme Court ruled on the Dred Scott decision. And you're thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, Dred Scott was a slave who had petitioned through the state court and the district court and now is at the federal court level because he thinks he should be a free man. So Dred Scott has appealed that he should be a free man, not a slave, and he's gone through the local, state, district, and federal courts. He's all the way appealed to the Supreme Court because obviously if you're all the way to the Supreme Court, you've been what at each of those other levels? Denied. Okay? So all the way to the Supreme Court, he appeals that he should be a free man. Now, I want you guys to think, the other class was close, but they didn't get her. I want you to think, why in the world, at this time in history, when we're talking about slavery and free and slave states and all this kind of business, why in the world would a man who was a slave all of a sudden think he should be a free man? Okay, just a second. You think he was kidnapped. That's not right, but it could be thought of as that in a way. Yeah.
Did he turn 25?
That's a good guess. Now, listen to this. I want to make sure you're clear because the other class said the same thing. The Missouri Compromise added in the Talmadge Amendment, right? That allowed Missouri to come in as a state, as a slave state, but they had to set these guys free. Until when? Until it was repealed. Until the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's good though, because that's good point to bring up is those laws as far as no more slaves coming into Missouri and the ones turning 25 that were born into slavery, that's out the door because they repealed that Missouri Compromise, okay? So keep thinking, why would a guy that was a slave most of his life probably think now that he should be free? Why would he appeal? What would be his reasoning to do that? Why should he be free? You're on the right track, not exactly true, but you're thinking. Think about what we've talked about, changes that have happened, things that have gone on. You're kind of in that area. He doesn't run away to a free state.
He was born in a free state?
He wasn't born in a free state. What? His owner moved. Looking for the MVP today. His owner moved from a slave state, Missouri, to a free state, Wisconsin. And he thought because he was transferred from a free state, from a slave state to a free state, since slavery is illegal there, that he should be free. Does that not make sense? Okay. Well, let's see how they rule. So again, Scott's argument was that he should be a free man because his owner had taken him from a slave state, Missouri, to a free state, Wisconsin. Now, obviously the local court ruled no, right? And then the state court of Missouri ruled no. Then he appealed all the way to the Supreme Court wanting to change that. Now, do you think that's reasonable what he's asking for? Okay, well, the Supreme Court ruled the following. They ruled that residents in a free territory and or a free state had not given Dred Scott his right to freedom. They ruled that his residence moving from a slave territory or state into a free territory or state had not given him his right to freedom. Now, I want you to think about that a little bit. And it took a while, but we got this done in the other class. What in essence does that say? If Dred Scott, who was a slave in a slave legal state, moves to Wisconsin, a free state where it's illegal to have slaves, what does it say when that Supreme Court says that he cannot be free?
Because he went to the local courts in Wisconsin and they still said no. So like the residents in Wisconsin said no.
No, once you go to the Supreme Court, you're done. That's the final decision, no more appeal.
Yeah, but the local court said no.
And so what does that, why would that, that doesn't mean, that's a good point, that doesn't mean the Supreme Court's gonna say no, if they think it's wrong. But what does that say, that decision?
That owners with slaves can move to like the free states and like possibly like sway their opinion.
No, he's moving to a state he cannot have slaves in.
That probably doesn't